Okay, so today I want to talk a bit about the Roman province of Britannia, or Roman Britain. This is a pivotal period of British history due to the fact that for the first time, the island of Britain becomes incorporated in the wider world. Prior to this period of time, we had very limited trade contacts with continental Europe, and though the people in Britannia, the island of Britain, shared cultural similarities with the Gauls, with the other Celtic peoples of Western Europe, they were largely isolated, and their cultural practices kind of reflected this. To the Greeks or Romans, the peoples on Britain were especially primitive and savage. Britain was looked at as kind of an island of barbarism, mystery, monsters, kind of a fabled land almost. So the purpose of this segment of the lecture is to describe how Britain was brought into the wider Mediterranean civilization that dominated Europe at this point in time. And of course, to understand that, we have to take a look at Julius Caesar, because he's the first military adventurer or commander with the gumption and craft necessary to not only land in Britain, but to actually win victories there. Caesar was a Roman aristocrat. He was a consummate politician. And it was his career that laid the foundation for the transformation of the Republic into an empire. Caesar was part of a political faction called the Populares. In Rome at the time, there were two major parties, the Populares and the Optimates. And the Populares kind of were seen as the party of the people, the Optimates, the party of the elites. And of course, it's kind of a misnomer, because the Populares, their politicians were all members of the elite themselves. There was no true kind of truly popular movement. But Caesar was able to captivate the masses, and particularly the soldiers, and secure their loyalty, and thereby secure his own position in the Republic. Caesar was by no means a weak military commander. He was a very skilled military commander, but it was as a politician that he excelled the most. Caesar treated his soldiers with a certain amount of reverence. He ensured that their pay was increased. He ensured that after they left the army, they were taken care of. He was seen as somebody who took care of his people. In fact, he was seen as personally more reliable than the actual government of the Republic, which is one of the reasons that he was able to overthrow the Republic, subtly at least. But one reason that Caesar gained such popularity also was the fact that when Caesar formed what was called the Triumvirate with Crassus and Pompey, two other Roman generals, Caesar conquered lands to the west of Rome, Gaul, what's now France, and invaded Britain. And unlike the lands that Pompey and Crassus had invaded, which were to the east, these were lands which were known about, were kind of, were seen as lacking mystery. Caesar's conquests were over mysterious new peoples whom the Romans didn't know much about. They had had contact with Gauls. In fact, the Gauls had sacked Rome in 390 BC, but they didn't have sustained contact to the point to where they could understand Gallic culture. The Gauls were seen as very mysterious, as very savage and barbaric. The Romans generally preferred to be clean-shaven and have short haircuts for men. The Gauls had long hair, very long mustaches. The Romans wore tunics. The Gauls wore trousers. In fact, they were the people who introduced trousers to the world. This is due to the fact that the Mediterranean climate was less harsh in the wintertime than what would occur in Northern Europe. On top of this, the Gauls were physically larger than the Romans. They were taller. They were considered to be more burly in terms of their builds. And of course, when you couple that with the fact that the Romans saw their culture as barbarous and their behavior as savage, you have a very ferocious opponent. And Caesar defeated these people. His invasion of Gaul led to the death of around 1 million Gauls, and he completely subjugated a gigantic landmass, so the area of what's now France. And so, by bringing these people under domination, he increased his popularity even more than his rivals, who had also conquered other territories. And the Gauls were not just seen as mysterious. In a way, while they were seen as barbarous and primitive, they were also seen as somewhat virtuous. For example, Caesar's father had wanted him to have a Gaul as a tutor instead of a Greek, because he believed that the Gauls had a disdain for the kind of homosexual relationships that were common between tutors and students in the Mediterranean world. And he saw that as part of their kind of rustic virtue, right? That the Gauls were manly, they were tough, they were industrious, they were hardy, and they were simple. They weren't given to the kind of excesses that more civilized peoples suffered from the standpoint of many Romans. So when Caesar conquered these people, he brought into the empire a land that many people wanted to know about. And of course, he wrote down his conquests in his own account, which of course he's going to make his own self out to be kind of the hero of the story. But this was something that people who could read clung to. And this helped to make Caesar extraordinarily popular. And part of that was his invasion of Britain. Prior to this time, the Romans saw Britain as kind of a land shrouded in mist. I mean, physically shrouded in mist. The English Channel was thought to have sea monsters living in it. There were thought to be all kinds of monsters and wild men living on the other side of the English Channel. The Britons were seen as being even more savage than the Gauls, kind of like the Gauls times two. And of course, from the Roman standpoint, the Britons a lot of the men were tattooed from head to toe in woad, the kind of blue dye that I talked about last time. And they practiced human sacrifice with very ancient Druidic rites and very large armies. Well, when Caesar invaded Britain, and he would invade Britain twice, even though he didn't create a lasting conquest, this was seen as kind of a sign of just how brave he was, how glorious his campaigns were. Because one of the ways that you impressed the Roman public was that you added to the majesty of the Roman state. The Romans seeing their society as superior to all others, and he's kind of proving that on the battlefield from their standpoint. Caesar's legionnaires had a number of advantages militarily over the native Britons. For one, they had a cuirass called a lorica segmentata, a type of breastplate made of interlocking iron plates that was very hard for the weapons of the time to penetrate. They had on iron helmets, as well as, in some instances, shin guards. They had a a very large concave tower shield called a scutum that they would interlock that would protect them from arrows. They would carry a type of javelin called a pilum, which it had the head of the javelin was made out of very soft iron. The reason for this was so that it would bend once it went into an enemy shield. The pilum wasn't designed to kill the enemy soldier, it was to deny him his shield. So it had a weight on one end, and the blade of the javelin on the other. The blade would pierce the enemy's shield, and it would bend, so it would become impossible for the enemy to easily extract the pilum from his shield, but it was so heavy that the enemy had to drop their shields. So it would deprive them of one of their major weapons. And of course, the Roman soldier had his scutum, his giant tower shield, on hand to protect him. And they used a type of short sword called a gladius that was originally developed by Celts in Spain. And the reason that the short sword was preferred over a longer sword, even though a longer sword would give you longer reach, the short sword actually exposed the arm less than a longer weapon. It was primarily for thrusting. So you would have Roman soldiers, legionnaires, in formation with their shields interlocked, and they would march forward and they would thrust through the gaps in the shields. And in a lot of instances, they would, in formation, kind of run over the enemy, and as they trampled the enemy, they would stab them. They would stab, the second, third, fourth ranks would stab the enemies on the ground. And this was very effective against the Celtic warriors. The reason for this is, as we said with the last lecture, that the Gauls and then later the Britons primarily attempted to break their enemies in a kind of glorious charge, a sort of pell-mell assault, and it was designed to scatter the enemy through sheer force. And of course, the Romans had the perfect army for countering this tactic. Heavily armored, well-protected, disciplined troops in formation with their shields kind of interlocked. And once the enemy crashed against their shields, against their line of shields, they were then ripe for being butchered. The Celtic soldiers generally didn't wear, the normal foot soldier didn't wear a lot of armor. We had already mentioned how some of the Celtic soldiers would actually fight naked. And of course, this made them very vulnerable to Roman short swords. And of course, it made the pilum, the plural pila, made the javelins that the Roman soldiers threw very deadly as well. So the the Romans also had a formation called a testudo, which means tortoise. And that's where they would, the first rank would put their shields up interlocked together. The second, third, fourth, fifth ranks would hoist their shields above their heads, and it would form kind of a tortoise shell formation. And this made the Roman soldiers very well protected against enemy arrow fire. So they took that advantage away from the Celts when they did battle. When Caesar first landed in Britain, ostensibly, he felt justified because British tribes had helped the Gauls in their war against him. And of course, he really wanted to gain the fame from exploring this new realm. Caesar crossed the English Channel with 2 legions. They landed and they fought some skirmishes against the Britons, and the Romans won. And as a result of these victories, Caesar was able to make peace treaties with the Britons that were favorable to Roman rule. In 54 BC, Caesar invaded Britain for a second time and brought over 5,000 men with him. Previously, when he landed, he had to fight his way onto the beaches. This time, the enemy yielded him his beachhead, and he marched inland and crossed the Thames River and ultimately after some skirmishes, the Briton leaders who were, and Britain is in Briton, that's what we use for the name of these tribes, they agreed to a peace treaty, kind of a client status, paying tribute to Rome. So Caesar left without establishing a true Roman province. Almost a century would pass in which Roman interest in Britain kind of waned until the Emperor Claudius sent 40,000 troops to Britain to conquer it and to make Britain a province of the Roman Empire. That province would be called Britannia. And Claudius wanted control of Britain not just for the prestige of adding a new province to the empire, but because Britain had vast reserves of precious metals, iron, in particular tin, and these were needed by the Roman military and economy, and so Britain was seen as economically valuable. On top of this, many slaves came from the various Brythonic Briton tribes that dotted the British Isles, right? And these slaves were very popular. I'd already mentioned how Caesar's father had seen Gallic slaves as very popular because they were perceived as being very humble and very rustic. And it's the same thing with slaves from the British Isles. And so you start to see slaves from the British Isles become popular in slave markets throughout the empire. And of course, there's also the vast agricultural lands that were part of Great Britain, particularly growing grain, barley, wheat, etc. And these were very, very popular for the western half of the empire. Most of Italy was fed by grain from Egypt, but for Hispania, what's now Spain, Gaul, France, the addition of Britannia to the empire increased the available foodstuffs in that region. The presence of the Romans, their establishment of their colony at Londinium, and the rapid expansion of slavery across Britain eventually led to great resentment. And that resentment would be personified in the person of Boudica. Queen Boudica was the queen of the Iceni tribe. Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, was the king of the Iceni. When he died, he attempted to preserve Boudica's inheritance by leaving half of his kingdom to the Romans and half to Boudica, thinking that, well, if I leave the Romans half, then they will agree to preserving the other half for my queen. However, this had the opposite effect. The Romans then claimed the whole portion, and when Boudica attempted to press her claim, she was flogged, and her daughters, by Prasutagus, were violated by the Roman legionnaires. So the Iceni were the tribe where this revolt first started under Queen Boudica. They rose up, they massacred the Roman Ninth Legion, and they burned several, the three biggest Roman settlements in Britain to the ground, including Londinium. This happened in 61 AD, and Roman retribution was immediate. The following year, a large number of Roman troops crossed the Channel, defeated the Iceni and the other tribes of the Britons, and absolutely annihilated the rebels. What they generally did is they would kill the males and take the women as their own, as the property of their soldiers, and the road leading to Londinium was essentially marked from the coast to Londinium across the Thames with thousands of crucifixions. Any rebels who were captured or anyone who was known to have associated with the rebellion, if they were male, they would find themselves nailed to the cross. And of course, this was part of the punishment, the psychological terror that the Romans enacted upon the revolting British tribes. And it was very effective. Britain would generally see peace for the rest of its time as a Roman province, particularly southern Britain. And Britannia would become a very wealthy, very prosperous province. Of course, the quote by the important Roman historian Tacitus kind of is relevant here. They make a desert and call it peace. Yes, Britannia would be a prosperous, peaceful province of the Roman Empire for the next 300 years longer. At the same time, at what cost? That's certainly the death of most of the males of the original peoples. So as the Romans occupied Britannia and communities like Londinium began to thrive, these walled settlements that were built in Roman fashion, you had many Roman soldiers who would take wives from the surviving Briton population of the Briton tribes, and in some instances legitimate children would be produced. In other instances, illegitimate children would be produced. But these communities were generally bilingual after this point. They would speak both Latin and the original languages of the various Celtic tribes. The Roman government and Roman merchants in Britannia would export grain, they would export slaves, and in particular tin and other metals and other mineral wealth, sources of mineral wealth out into the rest of the empire. And the upper class in Britannia would develop along Roman lines, and the same model of Roman aristocratic life that you might see in Italy, with kind of ostentatious villas, with walled gardens, and very large families with many different servants, etc. And part of this was the Roman baths. The Romans would congregate in kind of public baths and saunas in which you could relax, and they were seen as having being very beneficial for one's health. And of course, this is something that they brought to Britannia. And we have archaeological remnants of these baths that still exist. Looking at this map, you notice that the Roman province of Britannia was the southern portion of Britain. What's now called Scotland was not part of the Roman Empire. The Romans did invade Scotland, which they called Caledonia, if you've heard that word before. The problem was that Scotland was seen as economically unviable. There was no particular benefit to occupying the territory. And when you consider the fact that the peoples who lived in Caledonia, Picts, if we remember the Picts were a Celtic culture that the Romans saw as even more savage and barbarous than the Britons from southern Britannia. So the Romans would have to fight the Picts and contribute a great amount of lives and money to control a region that was seen as desolate, as barren, as too cold to be of economic value. So what the Romans did is, instead of attempting to occupy Caledonia, what's now called Scotland, they built a large wall, Hadrian's Wall, which functioned in the same way as the Great Wall of China in northern China. The idea was that you build this large wall and you keep the barbarians out. You man the wall with legionnaires, and the barbarian peoples, the Picts from the Roman standpoint, would be unable to invade southern lands and take away the great wealth that was being produced in Britannia. The wall took around 14 years to complete, and after that, it was regularly maintained by soldiers and was very effective. It did, in fact, reduce the damage caused by Picts attempting to raid into southern Britain. Over time, as the empire declined, the wall would no longer be manned, and the border between Britannia and Pictland, or what the Romans called Caledonia, would become less secure. But while the Romans maintained a strong military presence, Hadrian's Wall was very effective in keeping the Picts out of Britain. And we'll talk more about this, the collapse of Roman rule and the invasion of the Angles and Saxons, in the next lecture.